Good evening. Thank you, Robert, for that generous introduction. It's a real delight to be with you tonight. Thank you to FIRE for inviting me and for the great work that the organization does in defense of free speech. And thank you to all the students for being here and for trekking across the country to support free speech. My plan is to talk for about 20 minutes and then open it up to a conversation. And I'd be happy to talk about anything I talk about, or if you want to talk about NSA surveillance and whether the NSA has in fact stopped monitoring us, happy to do that too. So I remember very clearly when I was in your shoes, a student in college, perhaps nearing graduation, assembled to listen to someone ostensibly here to offer some words of wisdom. Well, I'm not sure I have any words of wisdom to offer you, at least not on the topic of free speech. While my gray hair may suggest otherwise, I'm here tonight not with answers to any of the hard questions about free speech, and there are many. Instead, I'm here with questions, ones that I hope you will consider as you carry the tradition of open dialogue forward. Let me start with what will be a familiar observation to you all, and then I'll get into some of the questions. The observation is this: the US Constitution affords particularly robust protection for free speech. We are distinct from virtually every other country in how strongly our First Amendment safeguards all manner of offensive and hateful speech from government regulation. The legal case that perhaps most famously captures our approach toward free speech is the case of the neo-Nazi marchers in Skokie, Illinois. If you're not familiar with the case, it still today reflects a major fault line between the American approach and that of other countries, and it also reflects a major fault line in public sentiment toward free speech domestically. In 1977 and 1978, Frank Collin, the neo-Nazi leader of the National Socialist Party of America, tried to organize a march of his fellow neo-Nazis in the Chicago suburb of the village of Skokie. Skokie had, and today still has, a large Jewish population, and in the 1970s, it was home, in particular, to many survivors of the Holocaust. You can imagine the feeling of that community toward the neo-Nazis' planned march. The village of Skokie responded by enacting legislation designed to shut the march down, including a bill outlawing the dissemination of speech inciting racial or religious hatred. In the lawsuits that followed, the American Civil Liberties Union, where I used to work, represented Frank Collin in challenging Skokie's new ordinances and defending Collin's right to march. The courts ultimately sided with Collin, holding that he had a constitutional right to lead a nonviolent march of neo-Nazis through the streets of Skokie. Now, the planned march in Skokie never actually took place, but the case has come to symbolize the American approach toward hateful speech. With very few and very narrow exceptions, the First Amendment to our Constitution has been interpreted to protect even the most offensive and hateful speech. Here's the first question: why? Why has the Supreme Court interpreted the First Amendment so expansively? There are three traditional answers to this question. I'm sure you're familiar with all of these. First, and perhaps the most well-known, is that allowing all opinions to be expressed will ensure that we find the truth. This is often referred to as a truth-seeking rationale, and it was made perhaps most eloquently by the great poet and polemicist John Milton in his essay Areopagitica, in which he opposed the licensing scheme that England had enacted in 1643. Here's a bit of his inimitable prose. "And though all the winds of doctrine were let loose to play upon the earth, so truth be in the field we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength. Let her and falsehood grapple, whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter." In other words, truth will prevail. Now, interestingly, the philosopher John Stuart Mill, another free speech luminary, was not convinced of this argument. In fact, in defending free speech and On Liberty, what he called the liberty of thought and discussion, he rejected this argument, saying, "The dictum that truth always triumphs over persecution is one of those pleasant falsehoods which men repeat after one another till they pass into commonplaces, but which all experience refutes." Mill proposed a slightly different version of the argument of the truth-seeking rationale. The idea, as he explained it, was that we humans are fallible and justified in believing what we do only because we are willing to confront the counter-argument. The freedom to contest an opinion, he said, is the very condition which justifies us in assuming its truth for purposes of action. The second explanation often given for the protection of free speech is that it is necessary to self-government. We can't know the majority's will without freedom of expression, and we can't hope to displace today's majority without the right to dissent. Giving a political majority the power to silence dissent would enable state-sanctioned orthodoxy. James Madison, one of our nation's founders, adopted this rationale in 1800 in arguing against Virginia's enactment of a Sedition Act, explaining that the nature of governments, elective, limited, and responsible in all of their branches, may well be supposed to require a greater freedom of animadversion, criticism, than might be tolerated by the genius of such a government as that of Great Britain. And he was being a little cheeky here, accusing his critics of having British sensibilities. The third explanation often given for our expansive free speech right is generally called the autonomy rationale, the idea that we have a basic right as humans to say what we wish. And this is the rationale that has dominated the Supreme Court's free speech opinions for the last few decades, and you can find it in any number of the court's decisions. So these are the traditional arguments for free speech, which American courts have drawn on to interpret the First Amendment. Now, many free speech scholars have argued that these theories do not fully account for a free speech tradition as robust as ours. For example, they've observed, as Mill did, that it's just not true that truth will always prevail, at least in the short run. They've argued that while humans are fallible, surely we can be confident that at least certain ideologies, maybe Nazism, are wrong and no longer need to be debated. Even Mill acknowledged this possibility in his writing, saying that it was necessary to consolidate public opinion from time to time. And still others have noted that the right to say what you please sometimes conflicts with the right of someone else to say what she pleases, or to hear what others have to say. To fill in these and other perceived gaps in the justification for our First Amendment jurisprudence, a number of additional rationales have been offered over the years. Among others, there is a theory that hateful views are better countered through exposure and engagement than suppression. There is the argument that the expression of hateful ideologies is a kind of social barometer, giving us important insights into hateful ideologies and their adherents. There is the hope that modeling tolerance of hateful individuals will, in time and perhaps across generations, desensitize us to their views and defang their assaults. There's the concern that even if we could agree upon which speech to censor, we couldn't entrust our majoritarian institutions to set or to enforce the rules. And there's the belief that a broad freedom of speech forces us to develop and maintain the ability to coexist as individuals with radical differences in opinion. Of course, a lot could be said in support of or in opposition to these defenses of free speech. There are thoughtful critiques of our capacious right of expression that highlight its substantial costs, particularly for women and communities of color. There are thoughtful justifications of it that are clear-eyed about those costs and that emphasize the importance of dissent to marginalized voices in particular. And of course, even if you accept all of these justifications enthusiastically, they don't dictate a specific answer to the question of precisely how broad our protections for free speech should be. There are many democracies with more limited free speech protections than ours, but I think most of us would still consider these countries to be fundamentally democratic. Tonight, I actually want to steer clear of the debate over how robust our constitutional protection of free speech ought to be. And instead, I want to focus on a question that First Amendment advocates like myself often gloss over. As you know, there are really two freedoms of speech in the United States. There is the constitutional freedom of speech, our First Amendment right against governmental constraints on expression. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And then there is our cultural freedom of speech, the shared sense of those in this country that we ought to be able to express our views without undue retaliation by our neighbors, our colleagues, our classmates, or others. This is an ethos, not a code. It is not enforceable in court, but at most through social convention and expectation. And it is only as durable as our collective belief in it. But what is this cultural and not constitutional freedom of speech? What does it entitle us to say? What does it discourage us from saying? The reality, of course, is that it is whatever we want it to be. We give shape to our cultural freedom of speech in the way we express ourselves, and maybe more importantly, in the way we react to the speech of others. And so the questions become, how should we express ourselves, and how should we allow ourselves to react to the speech of others in a society that wishes to cultivate free speech? On the one hand, it may be tempting to believe that our cultural freedom of speech should replicate our constitutional freedom of speech. In other words, if the First Amendment prevents the government from restraining some form of speech, our cultural freedom of speech should likewise prevent private actors from restraining that same form of speech. But of course, this can't be right. When private actors restrict the speech of others, they're often exercising their own right to free speech. Think, for example, of a theater owner who carefully decides which plays to put on. Must she take all comers, as a municipal theater might have to, or may she curate her performances, or take instead a newspaper that exercises editorial control over the pieces it publishes? Must it take every submission or only those it deems fit to print? On the other hand, it may be just as tempting to believe in the opposite extreme, that our cultural freedom of speech should condone all private restraints on speech. That is, we should all be free to punish others in whatever way we can through the exercise of private power. For example, by firing them from their private sector jobs or by kicking them out of their private schools, based on whatever disagreement with their speech or beliefs we decide is too great. With certain exceptions in contract law or state law, this approach might be perfectly lawful, but it is no more appealing than the other extreme. While private restraints on speech are not the same as governmental ones, both can suppress expression a free society should allow. Both can drive dissenting views from the public square. Both risk calcifying public discourse and enshrining majoritarian orthodoxy. Well, if neither extreme is the answer, how do we find the middle ground? To my mind, this is one of the hardest questions in free speech. You do not often hear this question discussed explicitly as such, but it does come up all the time in the news and likely on your campuses, in your places of employment, and at your dinner tables, maybe tonight. When it does come up, it is often attached to the phrase cancel culture. Now, to be candid, I have mixed feelings about the conversation around cancel culture. Very often, the accusation seems to be made against what I would consider to be counterspeech. When a speaker expresses a controversial view and others very vocally and publicly criticize that view, we have speech and counterspeech. And the accusation that the response is a form of cancel culture, rather than a valid form of counterspeech, often seems to reflect not anything about the nature or manner of the criticism, but rather the allocation of power between the two speakers. Mill himself was particularly attuned to the power dynamics of speech and counterspeech. In rejecting the argument that we should permit all speech so long as it is expressed in a temperate manner, Mill cautioned that such a rule would benefit those already in power. He said, with regard to what is commonly meant by intemperate discussion, namely invective, sarcasm, personality, and the like, the denunciation of these weapons would deserve more sympathy if it were ever proposed to interdict them equally to both sides. But it is only desire to restrain the employment of them against the prevailing opinion. Against the unprevailing, they may not only be used without general disapproval, but will be likely to obtain for him who uses them the praise of honest zeal and righteous indignation. In other words, a rule that we should all just be nice to one another tends to favor the majority and to be used to further marginalize dissent. Now, as you know, we've seen this kind of selective invocation of the principle in recent years. The accusation of cancel culture has been levied against those who criticize the modern-day vestiges of slavery. It has been made against those who have excavated the racist origins of our institutions or the racist beliefs and practices of our founders. And it has been used to dismiss those who have peacefully protested controversial speakers on their campuses. At the same time, few, if any, have made the same accusation against those who have supported ag-gag laws, which criminalize private reporting on the environmental practices of agricultural companies. Few have made the accusation against those seeking to banish the discussion of critical race theory or of the New York Times' 1619 Project from the classroom. Few have made it against those who resisted the hiring by UNC Chapel Hill of Nicole Hannah-Jones, and few have made it against those who have labeled pro-Palestinian speech anti-Semitic or who have sought to condition government contracts on a disavowal of the movement to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. So I have a concern about the selectivity of those who say they're concerned with cancel culture. But at the same time, there are forms of social pressure that concern me. It makes me uneasy when someone, especially someone without means or political clout, loses their job because of their political views. And I'm uncomfortable when the protest of a controversial speaker on campus reaches the point of disruption that effectively shuts down the event. These examples seem to cross a line. But again, where is that line? Some have argued that the line should be at coercion. The argument is that social censure is legitimate up until it becomes coercive, because at the point that it becomes coercive, it becomes something other than speech. For example, threatening someone's livelihood or using a loudspeaker to shout them down is effective not because it is persuasive, but because it is intimidating. So there's an intuitive appeal to this argument. It seems to track the Supreme Court cases, which often draw a distinction between speech and conduct. But it is difficult to reconcile the full reach of this argument with one of the most celebrated First Amendment cases of the last century, NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware Company from 1982. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but the case involved a civil judgment of damages against the NAACP for its role in organizing a boycott of white merchants in Claiborne County, Mississippi. The boycott was part of the civil rights movement, and its purpose was to force local civic and business leaders to accept the NAACP's demands for racial equality on pain of economic injury inflicted by the boycott. Some of the merchants sued the NAACP and the boycott's participants, seeking to recover damages for their economic losses and to put an end to the boycott. But the Supreme Court rejected these claims, saying that the peaceful political activity that characterized the boycott has always rested on the highest rung of the hierarchy of First Amendment values. Now, boycotts can be economically coercive. That's their purpose. It was certainly part of the NAACP's strategy during the civil rights movement. It was part of the point of the boycott of apartheid South Africa. And it is presumably the motivation of many of those who today have boycotted Israel. But I think the Supreme Court was right to celebrate the importance of peaceful collective action, even when it takes the form of a boycott. Another possible line we might draw around our cultural freedom of speech has to do with natural selection. I was a biology major in college, so please forgive me for trying to understand everything through the lens of evolution. But we might think about the benefit of free speech as lying in its ability to exert a selective pressure on society to change. If society is to evolve, we need the ability to change it, and free speech allows us to try. It's an irritant that provokes change. It's the grain of sand in an oyster that creates a pearl, even if we don't want the grain of sand. But some selective pressures outpace the ability to evolve. For example, a species might be able to adapt to a slow change in the temperature of its environment, but not to a rapid one. An oyster can make a pearl around a grain of sand, but it would probably die if you jammed a rock inside its shell. Perhaps our cultural freedom of speech should reflect an analogous line. In other words, perhaps we should tolerate speech that pressures us to change, but not speech that overwhelms our ability to do so. On this theory, certain kinds of coercive speech would be acceptable, but overly coercive speech might not. This analogy, I think, has some conceptual appeal, certainly to me as with my biology background, but you might be wondering whether this analogy or any other is actually going to help us figure out where to draw the line between our cultural freedom of speech and speech we should discourage. And I think the answer is probably not. Unfortunately, neither the text of the First Amendment nor the many persuasive arguments made in favor of free speech tell us where exactly to draw the line. Ultimately, the task of defining our cultural freedom of speech turns out to be every bit as difficult and context-specific as the task of interpreting the phrase freedom of speech in the First Amendment, with the added complication, of course, that we can't just rely on 9 justices to tell us the answer. Instead, that question may just rely on a deep appreciation of the values that free speech serves and on a careful weighing of those values against the costs in any given case. I'm sorry if that's not terribly helpful, but in my defense, I did say at the outset that I came here tonight with questions and not answers. So where does this leave us? Well, for better or for worse, I think we are condemned to continually defining and redefining our cultural freedom of speech through a collective commitment to the values underlying free expression. If that's right, then it's all the more important that organizations like FIRE and students like you commit yourselves to the spirit of open dialogue and the values it serves so that we can collectively advance the cause, even if not any precise definition of our cultural freedom of speech. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions and engage in conversation about this or any other topic. I was saying on the walk over here that I wanted to talk about cancel culture tonight a little bit, but it's not a subject that I spent most of my career focused on. I'd love to continue that conversation, or also talk about anything else relating to free speech, the First Amendment, or NSA surveillance.
Hello. As the cultural freedom of speech that you mentioned earlier increasingly moves to private platforms and digital ones like Facebook and Twitter, are you at all worried that the profit motives of these companies will lead to, I guess, damage the speech that is available to us? Do you think that their profit motive could suppress free speech that otherwise would not have in a regular world?
Yes, absolutely. But let me tell you a bit about how I think about the response to that, because it may not align with my answer of yes, absolutely. This is an earth-shattering phenomenon for public discourse, that now public spaces are controlled by private corporations that organize the speech on their platforms in ways that are very unfamiliar to public discourse. They organize the speech on platforms, they prioritize it, they decide what to show you on the basis of algorithms designed to prioritize engagement. And we still don't really fully understand what that algorithmic prioritization of the public square has done to public discourse. Obviously, you can read the news every day and you can see that many people seem to speculate that it entrenches our political divisions, it polarizes us, it shunts us into echo chambers, and all of that may be right, but we still actually don't have that much quantitative analysis of what goes on the platforms for a variety of reasons that I'd love to talk to, because it's one of the things that I actually spend a lot of time working on and thinking about. But I don't actually think the answer is to regulate the platforms and prevent them from arranging the content that they host in a way that society, that a government might think is more desirable. For one thing, it turns out to be very hard to make those decisions, and I'm not sure I would entrust our, as I call them, majoritarian institutions to make those decisions. And so, and for another, it'd be very hard to design a regulation that would be consistent with the First Amendment, at least a regulation of content moderation as such. I think the more promising paths are ones that are, in the language of the First Amendment, content neutral, and ideally unrelated to speech. So for example, one possibility is competition policy and antitrust actions. I'm not sure personally that the blunt instrument of divestiture, like breaking up companies, or merger review, preventing them from joining, which is the main work of antitrust, I'm not actually that confident that that is going to significantly affect the public square. That might separate Facebook from WhatsApp, but you still have Facebook. And that's why I say competition policy, which is the larger box of tools that antitrust regulators have at their disposal. And there are a variety of things that might fall into that bucket. For example, privacy regulation can be a form of competition policy, because if you give users more control over their data, it makes it harder for companies to monopolize control over that data and keep out competitors. You might think of interoperability mandates as an important form of competition policy, because they open up competition in the space by allowing you to take your data elsewhere if you want, or you to communicate with people on other platforms. I'm going to date myself here, but there was a time when the major social media platforms interoperated. And that's because they weren't really major social media platforms at the time. They were small ones. There was AOL Instant Messenger and a variety of others. And there was software you could download to your computer that would allow you to connect all of the accounts to a single interface. And if your friend was on AOL Instant Messenger, but you were on Google, you could type a message into the single interface that would communicate with either. You can't do that today. And I think that has been to the disadvantage of competition and the public square. But that's the direction in which I would look, more than some of what you see coming out of Washington, which are proposals to regulate the content moderation decisions of the platforms. I think content moderation on platforms is inevitable. Maybe we can regulate it a little bit lower down the internet stack when it comes, for example, to domain name registrars, who basically are the postal service of the internet. They give you an address. Maybe you could regulate it at the level of ISPs, requiring net neutrality, for example. I think it'd be much harder to do that higher up on the stack with the platforms that actually host content.
Sorry to bring it back to the cancel culture topic, but
no need to apologize.
Sorry. You mentioned feeling uncomfortable when someone without political power or clout loses their job over an opinion that they've expressed. How do you reconcile sort of their freedom to express themselves, but possibly like when they have a view that could be harmful to the people they serve, like if police officers are openly racist or nurses who are like big anti-maskers?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And to my mind, they're very different. To my mind, if somebody holds a view that impacts their job, that is related to their job, then I think it's likely fair game. If police officers are charged with equally enforcing the law, and if they are unable to commit to equality, then they shouldn't be the ones enforcing the law. And I should also be clear that I registered my discomfort with, the situation I had in mind more is a situation where, there's a mom and pop grocery shop on the corner, and they sell groceries. And they happen to hold a particular political view that's unrelated to their business and that you wouldn't necessarily know from their business. But somebody discovers their, political leanings and campaign, organizes a boycott around that to try to put them out of business. And that makes me uncomfortable. And I don't know that the right answer is to say that we shouldn't do that as a society. We obviously have a right to do that. You have a right to decide where to take your business, and it can be very powerful to withhold your business from somebody on account of their political views. It can be a very powerful way of letting somebody know how seriously you feel what you feel. And undoubtedly, that kind of protest has been an enormously important part of the advancements that we've seen in equality in particular in this country. So I'm not here to say that that should be off limits, but it does make me uncomfortable when we've gotten to a point where it's very hard to have even basic political disagreements without escalation to the point of trying to put somebody out of business. And when I used to work at the ACLU, one of the great things, by the way, about the ACLU is that even if you work in this one little silo, there are a dozen other projects at the ACLU doing all this, what I thought of as amazing work. And I used to spend a lot of time with the folks doing the reproductive freedom work of the ACLU. The main reason one of the reasons there's good friends, but one of the reasons I spent time with them is because I worked in national security, and one of the big fights you have in national security has nothing to do about policy. It has to do with Article 3 standing, whether your clients are entitled to go into court to sue. And it turns out that people challenging abortion restrictions also have that same kind of procedural fight. But one of the things I learned from those colleagues of mine at the ACLU is that their clients are some of the most despised people in their communities. They represent medical providers who provide the service of abortion, among many others. And their clients legitimately fear for their lives. And those people too, not just powerful political actors who we legitimately want to respond to through our own exercise of association and free speech, they too face the brunt of kind of community censure. And so I worry about such a stark division that is forming, in society. But again, I think it's very hard to figure out where precisely the line should be between what's acceptable and what isn't. And ultimately, there's nobody who can tell you one way or the other what the right answer is, because there isn't. You make the right answer through your collective choices every day.
Thank you very much. It's really nice. It's an extreme privilege to have you here. Been interested in your cases that you brought in, Knights First v. Trump. I was wondering, just a couple of quick questions. One, did you anticipate Justice Thomas's concurrence, and what do you think of it in the sort of chicken nugget version of what you thought about it?
Yeah.
And the reasoning behind why your case won could now be utilized to bring the conversation to a very different place. I was wondering if that was anticipated and what you thought about that. And then secondly, when it comes to utilities, what is the good argument why Verizon or T-Mobile should not just cut their accounts to so-called white nationalists or anybody that Twitter determines to be anathema to their standards? Should they just not cut off their ability to communicate? Lastly, NSA.
I should take notes.
This is the last one.
Yeah.
With regards to the NSA, it's hard to wrap the human mind around the entirety of the capabilities of the U.S. government, particularly the NSA, and their ability to see every aspect of our lives, the most intimate aspects of our lives, without us even knowing that it's happening. What recourse does an average citizen have who repels this, who doesn't want this in their lives? Is it just hopeless now? And I'm sorry, the last one, why on earth would anybody have a Facebook or Twitter account? Thank you.
I'm maybe not the best person to answer that last question. I think everyone in this room is probably better positioned to answer. I no longer have a Facebook account, but I do have a Twitter account. It's hard to participate sometimes in society unless you're willing to use the tools of the day. A lot of jobs require you to have a Facebook account. It can be hard to get a job in the first place if you don't have a LinkedIn account. Friends are on it. I think it's the network effect. People want to be where other people are. So let me try to take the other ones in order. So the Thomas concurrence. And for those of you not familiar, the Knight Institute litigated a case challenging President Trump's blocking of his critics on Twitter. We argued that he used his account in a way that reflected state action, such that the First Amendment applied to his blocking of his critics. And we said generally when the First Amendment applies, you can't block people on the basis of viewpoint. And we won in the lower courts. We won in the district court in New York. We won in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which sits in New York. As one of its final acts, the Trump administration petitioned the Supreme Court. It came a few months earlier. The Supreme Court petitioned, the Trump DOJ petitioned the Supreme Court for review. And the Supreme Court did not end up taking the case because it became moot by the time they fully considered it, because President Trump at that point no longer had a Twitter account. Twitter had kicked him off, and he was no longer president of the United States, and so could no longer exercise state action in running his account. But Justice Thomas concurred in granting the petition, vacating and remanding, which is what they did technically. And he wrote an opinion arguing that maybe we should consider these companies to be public utilities and should regulate them as such. And he pointed out what a lot of people on the political left had been pointing out, which is that these companies exercise enormous control over our public discourse. But strangely, those same people who make that point had a very strange reception to his opinion. I read his opinion and I found myself nodding along with part of it, but a little bit unsure about what to make about the bottom line. I don't actually know. I don't know those doctrines especially well, the public utility doctrine, or I forget the other one that he cited. I'm not sure how strong the argument would be for applying those doctrines to these companies, but I certainly agree with what he wrote motivated him to write the decision, which is the power that the companies exercise over public discourse. I think it is, I think it should cause us all concern, not as a matter of First Amendment, but as a matter of the cultural freedom of speech, because, First Amendment advocates are kind of repelled by centralized control over public discourse, generally governmental centralized control over public discourse. But here you have private centralized control. Okay, so those were kind of my thoughts. We certainly did not anticipate that concurrence. We assumed that the Supreme Court would either have taken the case months earlier or at that point just denied it as moot without comment. Verizon and AT&T and white nationalists, it was your second question. So this is a little bit more complicated. Verizon and AT&T, to my mind, occupy a different place in public discourse than do the social media companies. They are effectively the streets of the online world. And for the same reason that I don't think the owner of a private highway should prevent white nationalists from driving on their highway, I don't think Verizon and ISP should be in the business of deciding who gets to be on the streets of the internet based on their political views. Essentially, those companies decide whether you exist digitally. If you can't sign up through an internet service provider, you can't be on the internet. If you can't register your domain with a domain name registrar, you can't have a house on the internet. You can't have an address on the internet. And that, to my mind, shouldn't be what we expect of those companies for a variety of reasons. One, I think there's just a basic right to be where society is, and that, to my mind, is a bridge too far. Another is that at that level of the stack, keeping somebody, moderating content is a very blunt instrument, because you're denying somebody not just access to Twitter, not just access to Facebook, you're denying them access to, I don't know, the website, healthcare.gov. You're denying them access to their local, state and city resources. That is their digital existence, and so to my mind, that's a step too far. But some people have made this argument that, you can read a really interesting take on this by the CEO of a company called Cloudflare. Cloudflare is a content distribution network, which means that they help popular websites make their content available quickly around the globe. And they also provide protections against DDoS attacks, denial of service attacks. And for a controversial website, it's very hard to exist on the internet unless you have DDoS protection. It's essentially like having police or fire coverage of your house, right? And Cloudflare is essentially, they are one of the police offices. This is a really terrible analogy, but one of the police offices or the fire departments of the internet. And a couple of years ago, one day Matthew Prince, that's his name, woke up and decided he no longer wanted the Daily Stormer on Cloudflare. And he just called up his team and said, kick them off. And the site was immediately shut down. And then he later wrote an op-ed saying, this was too great an exercise of power. And it's a really interesting op-ed. I'd recommend reading it. It grapples with some of these questions. Okay, NSA and recourse. What recourse does the average citizen have? And the answer, unfortunately, is none. I spent 10 years now trying to convince courts that they should hear civil legal challenges to NSA surveillance. And they have largely said no, closed almost every door. One of the cases I worked on at the ACLU went up to the Supreme Court. We represented people who we thought were very likely swept up in a particular form of NSA surveillance called Section 702 surveillance, FISA Amendments Act surveillance. For example, we represented the chief defense lawyer for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is the mastermind of 9/11, being tried in the military commissions in Guantanamo. His lawyer, who communicates with people in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere as potential witnesses in that trial, including, I think, family members of KSM, people very likely to be caught up in NSA surveillance, and if not, then the NSA may not be doing their job. And the Supreme Court held 5-4, no standing. This goes back to this legal doctrine I was mentioning before. No Article III standing to bring the case in a 5-4 decision. And that came out February of 2013. June 5th of 2013, just a few months later, was Snowden. And that changed the game significantly, because all of a sudden there were some NSA practices we could challenge. And the very first document that the reporters working with Snowden released was an order, a court order issued by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which is our secret surveillance court. And it oversees some NSA surveillance, domestic NSA surveillance. It doesn't really oversee surveillance. And the order was compelling Verizon Business Network Services to hand over on a daily basis everyone's call records. And it turned out that one customer of Verizon Business Network Services was the ACLU. So all of a sudden, the ACLU had standing to challenge this particular program, the NSA's call records program. We challenged it. We ended up winning. A court held it was unlawful, and Congress then changed the law. And now, 8 years removed from Snowden, we have very little insight into how NSA surveillance practices have changed. Because we got that one kind of peek behind the curtain, but by and large, the intelligence community is still far too secretive in describing publicly how its surveillance works. And so I worry that as the years go on, once again, there will be an increasing gap between what the NSA is actually doing and what the public understands the NSA to do. And mischief hides in that gap. That's what happened, I think, prior to Snowden. I think we'll see that again without robust congressional oversight, without efforts to change the law, without courts more willing to make their decisions public or invite in outside counsel to argue the case of the American public in some of these otherwise one-sided cases. I don't know if that answers your questions, but I tried to get through them all.
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to misinformation and what you see the role of social media companies in regulating misinformation, whether it be relating to theories like the lab leak theory, or the role of politicians in terms of spreading what they willfully know to be misinformation. If you see a difference between that and misinformation spread unintentionally by individuals.
It's a really great question. I think government lies in particular is a really interesting topic. And, there have been folks in the First Amendment community who have wondered for some time whether the First Amendment ought to have a view about deliberate efforts by the government to mislead. There are a variety of First Amendment doctrines. One of the more important ones is one that entitles the public to information from government, and it's relatively limited in its reach, right? You have a constitutional right to access judicial proceedings. Beyond that, you're mostly relying on FOIA or laws. But as of yet, there is no real kind of First Amendment purchase on government lies or First Amendment constraints on government lies. But they can be particularly destructive. And the way we're currently set up, the way our legal architecture is currently set up, the main only form of accountability, though, is the ballot box. Making your displeasure known with politicians who lie when you go and vote. When it comes to misinformation on social media, I guess I would have two answers. I would give you one answer in the world that we're currently in and one answer in the world that I'd like us to be in. In the world I'd like us to be in, there'd be far more competition on social media. There would be a much more heterogeneous set of rules that decide what content you see online. Right now, 2+ billion people use Facebook. Facebook has estimated that each of those people on average has 2,000 posts in their newsfeed on a given day, and they see 200. So they see 10% on average, an average Facebook user. And Facebook decides which 10% they see. That's an enormous power that Facebook has over what people are exposed to. And it turns out, and there is a very recent study just a couple days ago, it turns out, unsurprisingly, what people are shown tends to be sensational or material that's going to cause them to feel outrage, especially kind of out-party outrage toward people who hold the opposing political view. And in the world that I like to see us in, there wouldn't be as centralized a set of rules, and ideally without a centralized set of rules with a more heterogeneous speech environment, it'd be less susceptible to hijacking. And here I'll draw again from my biology background. One reason that we have sexual reproduction as humans is for genetic diversity. And genetic diversity, it turns out, is a powerful defense against the spread of viruses, the viral spread of disease. And I think the same is true when it comes to the algorithmic prioritization rules online. We have a homogeneous set right now, and it is terribly unsurprising that they are susceptible to spreading information virally. If we had a more heterogeneous set, it wouldn't solve all problems. It wouldn't solve the problems of hate speech and intolerance online. It wouldn't solve the problems entirely of misinformation and the viral spread thing, but I think it would help. Now, we don't know. That's an empirical claim, and it can be empirically tested, and we don't know. But that's not the world that we live in. We live in a world where these companies do exercise that kind of control, and I think it's fair for people to call on them to do something, but I think it's also precipitous for them, because it's very easy to make a misstep. It's very easy to convince people by taking that action that the companies are conspiring to suppress one kind of speech or another, or one kind of political view or another. And I think that's a very difficult position for them to be in. And I don't envy that job, and I understand why it has led some of them to take the position that they want to moderate less and not more. But that's why I think we need a more diverse and varied speech environment and not a centralized one.
Should advocates of
freedom of speech see this as like a thick right, where there's a lot of interlocking values that mutually reinforce, such as like accountability, transparency, privacy? Or should we see this as like a thin right, which is one that's a little bit more bounded? Because those views might not be compatible in terms of how we'd want to like define the boundaries of speech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. My own instinct is that it is a thick right of sorts. I think it's hard to, if you look at free speech theory, if you look at First Amendment cases, it is hard to come up with a principle that explains every case that you think is right, every free speech cultural decision that you think is the right one. And I think the reality is that free speech serves a lot of values. You know, it's one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to lay out this, you know, array of values that people have lined up, because some of them explain some decisions, some of them don't explain others. What I find most challenging is the question of how to resolve conflicts among the values. And especially as a First Amendment litigator, you look at the text of the First Amendment, it does not answer any interesting questions. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. What is the freedom of speech? It can't literally mean something that takes the form of words. Contracts take the form of words. They have never been thought to be regulated by the First Amendment. There are plenty of examples, you know, patents take the form of words, not regulated by the First Amendment. You know, murder for hire, conspiracy, all sorts of things take the form of words, have never been thought to be subject to First Amendment regulation. And historically, that's not, you know, there's good evidence that's not how the founders thought about it, although I think history is often inconclusive when it comes to interpreting constitutional text. And so what do you do when you have, you know, so you have to turn to something. You need some interpretive tool aside from the text if the text is not going to help you and if history is inconclusive, or if at least it's limited, you know, in the insights it can give you, for example, when it comes to modern technology or modern forms of communication. And I think that means you turn to values, and you know, you turn to the values that were around at the time. But nobody has a particularly interesting theory for how to resolve cases that involve a conflict of values. You know, prior to, so I don't know, you know, maybe you all know the history of the First Amendment. Up until the early 1900s, the First Amendment basically was interpreted in a way that did not at all restrict government restraints on speech. People were routinely thrown in for sedition, thrown into jail for sedition, for criticizing the government. First Amendment was basically, you know, thought of as at most a restriction on prior restraints, on preventing people from publishing something, literally enjoining them from publishing, was thought to basically impose no constraint at all on punishment after the fact. And that changed, you know, started to change in the 1920s. You have a famous dissent from Justice Holmes in the Abrams case, which is where the marketplace of ideas concept comes from. You have Justice Brandeis's famous concurrence in the Whitney case, where he articulated a broader vision of what free speech meant. And most of those, interestingly, most of those early visions of what the First Amendment meant, and most of the, you know, the ones that were around as a matter of free speech theory when the founders were drafting the First Amendment, really focused on truth-seeking and self-government, not autonomy, interestingly. People at the time seemed to think that the First Amendment was mostly a utilitarian right. It served other ends. It enabled self-government. It enabled us to discover truth. But at some point around, I think it was in the 70s, there was a kind of shift in First Amendment jurisprudence toward a predominant focus on the autonomy rationale. And you know, it has ended up making the First Amendment more libertarian in nature rather than collectivist. And but you know, at the same time, I think it's hard to explain a First Amendment that doesn't incorporate some element of autonomy. How do you explain, for example, the Pledge of Allegiance case? You know, West Virginia versus Barnett, where the Supreme Court, in soaring language, you know, from Justice Jackson, says, you know, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, is that no orthodoxy, you know, can be set out by government. How do you explain that idea, you know, without some notion of autonomy? At the same time, what do you do when autonomy clashes with other values that the First Amendment was meant to serve? This Supreme Court tends to privilege autonomy, really without any kind of balancing. It says if there is a speaker in the equation, then the speaker's rights tend to predominate, even if there are other parties who have an interest you have free speech values that are implicated by the regulation at issue, it tends to be the very particular regulated speaker whose rights trump. I find that kind of intellectually incoherent and not particularly satisfying in answering hard First Amendment questions. I don't have a better, I don't have a particularly refined principle I could offer you in lieu of that one, but I find that, not to be particularly satisfying.
Hi, sorry, I'm going to bring it back to cancel culture.
So, I'm going to come sit at that table for dinner.
There's a large portion of Americans out there that have a blind faith, almost an idolization of politicians. And this has kind of led to a new kind of cancel culture where a politician has more influence than they ever had through media. And if there's a business out there that doesn't agree with the politician's religious or political beliefs, they can say that, and then there's that portion of the American people will boycott en masse. So is there a line, or should there be a line of that influence while a politician holds office, and how do we as a society navigate that through the future?
It's a great question. In some narrow set of cases, there may very well be a constitutional line, depending on how the politician expresses his or her view or urges constituents to boycott. Some of that might rise to the level of state action in some narrow set of cases. Maybe not the hypothetical you have in mind, but there might be a set of hypotheticals where that kind of government inducement rises to the level of state action, and in your example, it would seem to be viewpoint-based, unconstitutional. As a result, I think those cases would be very hard to litigate. We're actually seeing something like that playing out right now, right? We're seeing, arguments that, for example, look at the lawsuit that former President Trump recently filed, arguing that he was kicked off of Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms based on government inducement of the platforms to kick him off. I think as a factual matter, he's probably wrong. I think he probably wasn't kicked off because, politicians urged the companies to kick him off. He probably was allowed to stay on the platform a lot longer as a result of his government position and the company's fear that kicking him off would bring on his wrath. But if he could make out that case, that he was kicked off as a result of inducement by government officials, then I think that would reflect state action. And I think that would be the kind of what some people call jawboning that we don't want. We don't want the government to exercise coercive authority in a way that, suppresses speech on the basis of viewpoint. But I think that's a narrow set of cases where you're likely going to be able to make out that case. And then we're in the realm of the cultural freedom of speech. I unfortunately, as I, unintentionally revealed in my talk, don't have particularly great advice on how to implement the cultural freedom of speech. I don't know that I can tell you anything especially useful on how we as a society should push back against that, aside from trying to articulate our values and our principles and why we think in any particular case it's wrong for people to act on the basis of viewpoint. It's wrong to punish speech in a particular context. But at the same time, and this is what I pointed out in the talk, there are examples that I think of as ones we should celebrate that did involve very coercive speech. The boycotts of the civil rights movement were intentionally coercive within a power dynamic that was flipped entirely, obviously, right? Within a power dynamic in which those boycotting had very little political power and political clout. And so maybe that's the way of, maybe that's one way of understanding why we're comfortable with it there. But it can be a powerful way of expressing your view. And so it's hard to say that we should take it categorically off the table.
Hello. So you mentioned your work in NSA surveillance. I'm going to ask you a question about cyber policy, specifically concerning China's second multi-level protection scheme standards. So I was wondering, as you know, what do you think that will have, what effect do you think this is going to have on the freedom of the American private sector, and also what effect do you think it will have on American dealings in China?
I didn't actually catch the set of standards that you referred to.
Oh, okay. So the MLPS, aka the Multi-Level Protection Scheme in China, which got updated a couple of years ago, basically states that any company that does business in China is subject to full surveillance under the CCP.
Yeah. This is a real challenge. Let me start by pointing you to an essay that I think may be interesting on this point. We published an essay a couple of years ago by Professor Jack Goldsmith called, I think it's called the Failure of Internet Freedom or something like that, in which he makes the argument that in the late 90s and early 2000s, official administration policy reflected this great optimism that the internet was going to be a democratizing force, that it was going to be a way of slipping in democratic norms into authoritarian regimes in a way that they could not police, in a way that they could not resist, right? There was this kind of techno-solutionism embedded in our foreign policy. And his argument is that this has largely failed, and that it turns out that authoritarian regimes can police the internet. And China is, example number one. They've built an internet that they can control to an extraordinary extent, not fully, but to an extraordinary extent, and they can surveil it, and they can shut it off, and they can make it very difficult to exist digitally in a way that they don't want you to exist digitally. So what's the answer to that? I don't know. I think part of the answer is that this is what it means for nations to have sovereignty, and if our goal is to inject international human rights norms, it may be that we just can't do that surreptitiously through the internet to the extent that we thought we were going to be able to. And instead, we need to go back to the normal means of, the soft power of international human rights, like acculturation and acclamation, where you use those normal ways of exercising authority. And that obviously has not eradicated human rights abuses throughout the world, but I'm not sure that I think Jack was probably right that it was naive of us to assume that we had a shortcut through the internet to spreading, good think, and it would have been nice, but and I think it has obviously done a lot of good in many ways. You can also point out, costs of the globalization of the internet, but I don't think there's a shortcut, unfortunately.
So you mentioned in your speech the difference between cultural freedom of speech and constitutional freedom of speech, and how sort of the impacts of the deterioration of cultural freedom of speech have led to, again, sorry for bringing this up, but cancel culture. Yeah. You also mentioned, however, in your speech, sort of the uniqueness of our constitutional freedom of speech, especially not in comparison to authoritarian regimes, but to democracies. To the best of your knowledge, is there a similar cultural freedom of speech that exists in other democracies, like, say, for example, France, and a cancel culture that exists there? Or is it only because of our constitutional freedom of speech that we're afforded a cultural freedom of speech in return?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, I wish I could give you a more precise answer, but I think the answer is that there's, of course, cultural freedom of speech elsewhere. It just has different contours. And in France, it means one thing. In England, it means another. Most of the free speech theorists that we have relied on in our constitutional tradition are not actually, Americans. Milton was writing in the 1600s, opposing the licensing order in Great Britain, and articulating, maybe for the first time so eloquently, this principle against prior restraint. But I don't know the answer, and I think that it would probably be unsurprising to expect that the cultural freedom of speech in most places is going to be contingent on local circumstances. French has a strong cultural tradition generally, and I'm making a stereotype here, but it wouldn't surprise me if their cultural freedom of speech embeds, their very kind of, nationalistic excitement about their culture, and so I think these things are all interrelated, right? The constitutional freedom of speech itself exerts a kind of cultural force. It doesn't determine the answer, I don't think. And we can have a cultural freedom of speech that's very different. We could have one that is not nearly as capacious as our constitutional freedom of speech, in a kind of analogous way. But they're certainly related.
Hi. Do you believe that the high degree of skepticism citizens possessed following the Manning and Snowden leaks had and will continue to have an effect on the development of a more transparent and responsible domestic security apparatus?
I think it's a question for you. I joke, but I took heart from the beginning, like the first part of your question, because it seems to reflect a description that you have of your peers that I hope is true, that I hope is accurate, that people have embraced skepticism of the intelligence community. But I don't know how long-lasting that skepticism will be, and I think the reality is that people have a very fickle relationship with the intelligence community. As somebody who spent 8 years at the ACLU entirely, during the Obama administration, trying to convince mostly liberals that they should care about the Obama administration exercising what I thought to be unconstitutional national security authority. Then under the Trump administration, to watch those, to watch the kind of criticism of the intelligence community coming from, folks who under the Obama administration were never allies when it came to NSA surveillance. It was kind of like whiplash, right? The IC has been it was a political football for, I think, both of those administrations. And so if the skepticism lasts, that would be great. But I think the reality is we need to renew it from time to time. People forget, people are born and people die. And culture is what happens to persist across that time. But it doesn't persist on its own. Traditions are not passed down. Skepticism is not passed down except through, oral tradition and reading and education. So I hope you have it, and I hope you spread it.
We have time for, 2 more questions. So I was wondering what you think the worst proposed change to Section 230 you've heard is?
And there are a lot of contenders. So for those who don't know, Section 230 is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which immunizes platforms from being held liable as publishers of third-party content. It's essentially what has allowed our modern internet to be what it is, where Twitter and Facebook are not liable for what people publish on their on their sites. The worst proposed change. Maybe the worst one is just getting rid of it entirely without thinking through what should replace it. It's an interesting question what would happen if you got rid of Section 230. I think there'd be a good argument that certain parts of Section 230 would be constitutionally required, that certain elements of the immunity that the platforms enjoy, you could probably make a First Amendment argument, and the Supreme Court might very well buy the First Amendment argument that some of those immunities would be replicated by the First Amendment. Certainly not all of them. Some of them, I think, would be. Maybe the best arguments around 230 reform I've heard have to do with thinking about 230 not on its own terms, but just as a political lever to use to extract other concessions. Because one of the big complaints I have about the conversation around 230 reform specifically, or platform regulation more generally is that very few people, when they have the conversation, are precise about what problems they're trying to solve and how their proposed regulation would address those problems. I think there are a lot of problems when it comes to public discourse online. And most regulations are not really an effort to solve most of those problems, or maybe narrowly targeted at one, or they're just a general reactive, kind of lashing out. Let's get rid of 230 without thinking through what the consequences are going to be. But I think if we got more granular in the conversation, I think it'd be very, very helpful. Maybe just two authors who I might recommend you to read if you're interested. One is someone named Daphne Keller. Okay, you know her. She's great, and she writes a lot of really insightful things about content regulation and the platforms. The other is Jack Balkin, who's a professor at Yale, and he wrote a piece for us called "How to Regulate and Not to Regulate Social Media," and it's I think just exceptionally clear and provocative explanation of how we should think about regulating the platforms. Hopefully that's helpful.
Hi. Some prominent Republicans have proposed that social media companies be regulated as a public utility. What do you think of that proposal?
So, as I was saying earlier, I think it's an interesting idea. Let me give you what to me seems like the most interesting version of that proposal. So, the most interesting version, I think, would be to consider the underlying social network as the utility, access to which would be licensed, and the services that sit on top of that network as the private companies that would remain afterward. So, for example, and some people call this unbundling, the idea that you would separate Facebook into more than two, but conceptually two buckets or two companies. One would be the network itself, which is the list of people and their connections, and you would license access to that so other companies could come and build services on top of that network. And then the other company would be, for example, the newsfeed, and that would be Facebook's method of organizing the posts of your friends, and there would be other services too, like chat or whatever. But if you had access to the underlying network, then you could have you could have the CNN newsfeed or the Fox News newsfeed, and other companies could license access, and they could, moderate your newsfeed for you with different, prioritizing different values other than engagement. Maybe prioritizing, civic engagement and participation rather than, the kind of engagement that Facebook prioritizes, or maybe prioritizing, investigative reporting over kind of shallow sensationalism. That to me seems like a very interesting idea because it addresses the main barrier to entry into social media, which is the network effect of convincing enough people to get onto a new platform to have a critical mass so that others will come join, because it kind of wrests that away from Facebook and says, this is now the public's, this set of relationships and, and whatever. And it's kind of, if you think about it, and you try to analogize that to the physical world, it's kind of interesting. Nobody owns our relationships in the physical world, right? You're free to connect with whoever you want, whenever you want. If you want to maintain a roster, you can. It's called a contact book. People used to write these things down at one point. Nobody used to own that, right? There's nobody to kind of maintain your list of friends for you and tell you that if you want to be friends with somebody else, you had to, reach out to that person through them. But in our digital existence, that's exactly what Facebook is, right? They are the space between us. They are the new physics of human interaction. They are, I said this in another talk I gave, but they're not just social media. They are a social medium. They are a substrate of human communication and relationships. And that's strange. It's strange that a company owns the digital space between us in that way. And so this kind of unbundling requirement, which you might think of as public utility regulation, would be an effort at bringing that back, into the possession of society as a whole, so that you could license and have more competition, et cetera. So I think it's really interesting, this proposal, and Justice Thomas making it in that concurrence, and others making it. I think it's something that we should think through. But I'm not enough of an expert in media and communications to know whether it's the right approach or not. And I think we also just need more research and study, and it's very hard to study the way in which Facebook and its algorithmic prioritization of content are affecting society. In part because the companies don't want to give up the data, and in part because their terms of service make it hard to study them independently. We have bits and pieces, but the pace of that research is glacial compared to the scale of the problem. All right. Thank you so much.